On November 25th, 1177, the most powerful man in the East looked at the army coming to face him and laughed. Saladin had 26,000 men, cavalry that covered the horizon in dust. He was marching on the kingdom of Jerusalem like a storm, and nothing in the world seemed capable of stopping him. And in front of him, blocking the way, appeared this: a few hundred knights, fewer than 500, led by a 16-year-old boy who could barely hold the reins because leprosy was already eating away at his hands, and among them 80 monks in white cloaks. 80 against 26,000. To Saladin, that wasn't an army, it was a walking suicide, a mistake he would sweep off the path before dinner. He was so certain of victory that he had let his own army spread out across the field to plunder the Christian villages. Why worry? No one in their right mind would attack 26,000 men with 500. A few hours later, Saladin was fleeing the battlefield on a racing camel, alone, with his shattered army behind him. Of the 26,000 men, he would return to Egypt with 1 in 10. It was the worst defeat of his life, and the ones who inflicted it were exactly what he had laughed at: a dying king and a handful of monks. Stay until the end, because this is the story of how the most underestimated warriors of the Middle Ages turned a joke into one of the greatest military humiliations of all time, and of why their own enemy came to fear them like no other. To understand the scale of what happened that day, you first need to understand who Saladin was. Because history remembers him one way only: the invincible one. By the end of the 12th century, Saladin was the most powerful figure in the entire Middle East. He had united Egypt and Syria under his command, encircling the Christian kingdoms of the Holy Land like a noose that tightened every year. He was a brilliant strategist, a leader who inspired devotion, and history is fair about this: a man of honor, recognized even by his enemies. 10 years after that day, he would be the one who finally crushed the Crusaders and retook Jerusalem. That's how we remember him: the genius who won the Crusades. And this is where the wound lies, the thing that almost everyone who studies the Crusades carries in silence. We remember the Crusaders as the side that lost, the backward, brutal, outmatched side. Saladin is the master. The Christians of the Holy Land are the amateurs whose days were numbered. That's the image that stuck. That autumn of 1177, that image seemed simply true. Saladin saw that the kingdom of Jerusalem was weak, divided, poorly defended. Most of the Crusader forces were far away in the north. The throne was in the hands of a sick boy. For Saladin, it was the perfect moment. He gathered a colossal army, 26,000 men, 18,000 light cavalry, 8,000 heavy cavalry, and marched from Egypt into the heart of the Christian kingdom. The goal was simple and final: take Jerusalem. There was no reason to doubt it. No army in the kingdom could face that in open battle. The Christian cities locked their gates and prayed. And as Saladin advanced, he did the one thing an overconfident man does. He relaxed. He let his army spread across the countryside to plunder, burn, and pillage the villages along the way. He was so certain no one would challenge him that he let his guard down. That was the decision that would decide everything. But to understand why it was fatal, you need to meet the two unlikely men who were about to make Saladin pay for it. One of them was dying. The other commanded the most feared and most underestimated warriors in the Christian world. The king of Jerusalem was 16 years old, and he was rotting alive. Baldwin IV had been diagnosed with leprosy as a child. It said his tutor realized something was terribly wrong when the boy, playing with other children, felt no pain when they pinched him. The disease shows no mercy. It kills the nerves, deforms the body, consumes the extremities. At 16, Baldwin was already losing the use of one hand. Every year of his life was a step down toward death, and everyone around him knew it. Imagine what that meant. The most important Christian kingdom in the world, surrounded by the greatest enemy of its history. And on the throne sat a teenager who could barely hold a sword. To Saladin, this was confirmation that Jerusalem was ripe fruit ready to fall. But Saladin made the mistake everyone made with Baldwin. He confused a ruined body with a ruined man, because inside, that boy was made of steel. He refused to be carried in a litter like an invalid. He learned to ride and fight even as his body failed him. An Arab riding master taught him to control his horse practically with one hand. He decided early on that if he was going to die, he would die on his feet, in the saddle, defending his people. The disease had taken his body. It had not taken his courage. And beside this unlikely king stood the other protagonists of this story, the Knights Templar. Today, the Templars have become legend, mystery, conspiracy theory. But in 1177, they were something very concrete and very frightening. The most disciplined soldiers in Christendom, monks who took vows of poverty and chastity, and who trained for war like no ordinary knight did. Their rule forbade retreat unless they were outnumbered 3-1. They were never ransomed when captured. The order paid ransom for no one. In other words, a Templar in combat had two options: win or die. There was no third, and that's exactly why so many people still underestimated them. Monks playing at soldiers, some sneered. Men of prayer who thought they were warriors. That day, 80 of these monks were garrisoning the fortress of Gaza under the command of Grand Master Odo of Saint Amand. 80 men. Facing the storm that was Saladin, they seemed irrelevant, a king who was dying. 80 monks nobody took seriously, and 26,000 enemies standing between them and the salvation of the kingdom. What happened next should not have been possible. When Saladin crossed the border, Baldwin did the only thing he could do with so few men. He rushed to try to block him. At the coastal city of Ascalon, it was a disaster. Saladin simply went around the city. With his enormous army, he didn't need to waste time on Baldwin. He left the boy king locked inside Ascalon, practically a prisoner in his own fortress, and pressed on. The road to Jerusalem was open. Behind him, in Ascalon, the king and his few knights were trapped, isolated, powerless. Ahead of him, the holy city almost defenseless. Put yourself in Baldwin's place at that moment. You're a 16-year-old boy, sick, locked inside a city, and on the other side of the wall, the greatest army in the region is marching to burn everything your people built. Every instinct says stay. Staying is safe. Staying is reasonable. Leaving that fortress with a few hundred men to chase 26,000 was, to any sane mind, throwing your own life away. And that's exactly what he decided to do. Meanwhile, on the other side, Saladin's arrogance was working against him, only he didn't know it. Convinced that Baldwin was neutralized and that nothing else could stop him, Saladin made the mistake great armies make when they stop respecting the enemy. He let discipline slip. His troops spread across the plain to plunder, pillage, burn, and gather supplies. The army stopped being a closed fist and became an open hand, its fingers scattered across miles of countryside. The overwhelming force that made him invincible was, at that moment, dissolved into thousands of scattered men out of formation, thinking about loot instead of battle. Notice the irony that will define everything. Saladin's greatest advantage, the colossal size of his army, only worked if it stayed concentrated. Scattered, that number became a weakness. He had turned his own strength into his own trap. All that was missing was someone to close it. And at that exact moment, the gates of Ascalon opened, and the 80 monks from Gaza were already riding to meet them. Baldwin broke out of the siege at Ascalon, not with a great army, with what he had, about 375 knights. And he sent a desperate message to the fortress at Gaza, calling for the Templars. Odo of Saint-Amand didn't hesitate. The Grand Master and his 80 knights left Gaza and rode to join the king. Add it all up, Baldwin's knights, the 80 Templars, and a few thousand-foot soldiers gathered along the way. In total, fewer than 500 heavy cavalry and perhaps 2,000 to 4,000 men on foot. Let that number sink in. Against Saladin's 26,000 men, this was the entire hope of the kingdom of Jerusalem. 500 knights and a king who could barely hold the reins. If they lost, there would be no second army. Jerusalem would fall. The Christian kingdom in the Holy Land, built with a century of blood, would end that afternoon. But Baldwin and the Templars understood something mediocre generals never do. They knew they couldn't beat Saladin through force. 500 will never beat 26,000 by force. So they weren't going to fight with force. They were going to fight with timing. They began shadowing Saladin's army from a distance, like wolves following a herd, waiting for the enemy to make a mistake, waiting for the exact moment when that scattered, distracted mass would be most vulnerable. And the Templars were the perfect weapon for that kind of strike, because their strength was never numbers. It was shock. A Templar heavy cavalry charge wasn't a crowd of knights running forward. It was a single block of iron, men and horses trained to hit the enemy like one hammer, at the same point, at the same instant, without breaking formation, without falling back. Concentrated in the right place, at the right time. That charge could pierce an army many times its size the way a spear pierces a shield. They just needed one thing, the right place and the right time. And Montgessard, near Ramla, was where the two would meet. Before the battle begins, answer this. What really decides a battle? The size of the army or discipline and timing? Numbers or will? Saladin bet on numbers. Baldwin bet on everything else. Before the charge, something happened that the chroniclers never forgot. Baldwin had brought with him the most sacred relic in the kingdom, a fragment of the true cross. According to tradition, a piece of Christ's own cross. Facing the tiny army, with the enemy in sight, the leper king got down from his horse. That 16-year-old boy, his body destroyed by disease, knelt on the ground before the cross in front of all his men. Think about the effect of that. Every man there knew he would probably die. The odds were absurd. And there in front of them, the king himself, who had every right in the world to be in a bed, protected, dying in peace, was kneeling in the dirt, offering his own life alongside theirs. He didn't send them into battle. He went first. When Baldwin stood up and returned to the saddle, the men were no longer just 500 terrified souls facing 26,000. They were 500 who had decided together that this ground was worth their lives. Fear had turned into something else. It had turned into purpose. On the other side of the field, Saladin's men didn't even fully know a battle was coming. Many were still scattered, looting. The cavalry wasn't formed up. The giant army was disorganized, confident, thinking about anything but a frontal attack from that ridiculous band of Christians. Saladin had the numbers. But at that instant, Baldwin had the two things that win battles: timing and men willing to die. And then the leper king raised what was left of his hand, pointed to the heart of the enemy army, and the 80 monks in white cloaks spurred their horses. What happened in the following minutes went down in history as one of the most devastating charges ever recorded. The charge began. Fewer than 500 heavy cavalry bore down on Saladin's army, and at the spearhead were the 80 Templars, with Grand Master Odo of Saint-Amand leading them all. They didn't attack from every side. They did what they knew how to do better than anyone in the world. They concentrated all their weight on a single point, the center where Saladin was, and struck like one hammer. Chroniclers describe the impact as something that scattered Saladin's men in every direction. Picture the scene from the Muslim side. You're in the middle of an army that believes itself invincible, relaxed, half your companions far off looting, and suddenly a wall of iron, steel, and war horses tears through your ranks like a knife. There's no time to form a line, no time to count how many enemies there are. There's only the shock, the panic, and the man beside you falling. And here the math of the battlefield completely flipped. Saladin's 26,000 men couldn't use their numerical superiority because they were scattered, disorganized, caught off guard. At that exact point, at that exact instant, the 500 concentrated Christians were stronger than the scattered thousands. Discipline beat numbers. The closed fist crushed the open hand. The center of Saladin's army collapsed. And when the center falls, panic does the rest. The men who had been looting across the field saw the dust, saw their companions fleeing, and terror spread like fire through dry straw. 26,000 men stopped being an army and became a terrified mob, running to save their own skins. And in the middle of that chaos, riding with one good hand, his body consumed by leprosy, was the 16-year-old King Saladin had scorned, alive in the fight, watching the impossible happen before his eyes. But the greatest humiliation was still to come, because the most powerful man in the East was about to do something no Muslim chronicler could erase for generations. Saladin fled. The great Sultan, the genius who would go on to unite the East and retake Jerusalem, the man who had laughed at that toy army hours earlier, was now running to save his own life. And he only escaped because he mounted a racing camel and galloped away from the battlefield, abandoning what was left of his army to its fate. It wasn't an organized retreat. It was a rout, and the pursuit was merciless. The Christians hunted the fleeing army for nearly 20 kilometers. But the worst part wasn't even the battle. It was the road back. Saladin had to cross the Sinai Desert to return to Egypt, and the broken army was decimated along the way by hunger, by thirst, by the rains that came, and by Bedouins who fell on the stragglers like vultures. Men who had marched so proudly weeks before now died by the thousands in the sand. Saladin reached Cairo on December 8th. Of the 26,000 men he had invaded the kingdom with, he returned with 1 in 10. 9 out of every 10 men he took to conquer Jerusalem never came back. And here is the most important part of this entire story, the proof that doesn't come from our mouths, but from the enemy's own. It was Muslim historians who recorded Montgisard as one of the worst catastrophes of Saladin's career, a defeat so devastating, so humiliating, that according to them it was only redeemed 10 years later, when Saladin finally crushed the Crusaders at Hattin and retook Jerusalem. In other words, Saladin's own side considered that day a stain that took a decade to wash away. We're not the ones who called it a historic humiliation. They were. That is the verdict that matters. When the most powerful and most respected enemy of your era records, in his own words, that it was one of the worst days of his life, you know that what the men in white cloaks did on that field was real, and that what he had laughed at in the morning had become by nightfall his worst nightmare. Now step back and look at the whole battle, because it's a lesson that crosses the centuries. everything that looked like weakness on the Christian side was exactly what won. A leprous, dying king who should have been in bed. He was the one with the courage to leave the fortress and bet everything. His ruined body hid the hardest will on the field. Monks playing at soldiers. Those were the 80 men who pierced the heart of an army of 26,000. A tiny, ridiculous army, contemptible in the enemy's eyes. It was small and concentrated enough to become a spear where the giant was just a scattered mass. And everything that looked like strength on Saladin's side was what brought him down. The colossal size of the army became disorganization. Total confidence became carelessness. Certainty of victory made him scatter his troops to plunder, and it was that dispersion that opened the fatal gap. His pride was the weapon that defeated him. What made him invincible was exactly what made him flee on a camel. That is the truth Montgisard carves into stone. Numbers don't win battles. Will, discipline, and timing win battles. An army without discipline is just a large crowd, and a large crowd can be broken by a small, hard fist striking the right place at the right time. The Templars understood this better than anyone in their time. That's why, despite always being outnumbered, they became the most feared warriors in the Holy Land, to the point that years later, Saladin considered them too dangerous to let live, executing captured Templars he could otherwise have ransomed for gold. The fear he learned that day at Montgisard never left him. But this story has an ending almost no one tells, because 10 years later, that same Saladin would return, and his revenge would change the world forever. Here is the part that turns Montgisard from a beautiful victory into an unforgettable tragedy. Saladin was not a man who forgot. He returned to Cairo humiliated but not broken, and he spent the next 10 years doing the exact opposite of everything he had gotten wrong at Montgisard. He never underestimated the Crusaders again. He never again let arrogance scatter his army. He learned from his own defeat patience. He studied his enemies, waited for the moment when they would make the same kind of mistake he had made, and he waited, and the moment came. In 1187, 10 years after Montgisard, the Crusaders marched into the desert under a scorching sun and fell into a trap at the Horns of Hattin. This time, it was the Christians who let pride and haste get the better of them. This time, it was the Crusader army that was surrounded, thirsting, broken. Saladin crushed the military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a single day. And the captured Templars and Hospitallers? He ordered nearly all of them executed, because he had learned back at Montgisard just how dangerous those men were. Weeks later, Jerusalem surrendered. The Holy City returned to Muslim hands after almost 90 years. And the Leper King? Baldwin IV never saw Hattin. Leprosy finally won the battle Saladin never could. He died in 1185, at 24. His body nearly destroyed, but he had already gone down in history as the dying king who, at 16, humiliated the greatest conqueror of his age. This is the honesty this story demands, and what makes it greater. The Crusaders didn't win the war. Saladin won in the end, but that's exactly why Montgisard still shines. Because at the height of the power of the man who would go on to conquer everything, there was one day, a single day, when a dying boy and a handful of monks proved he was mortal, that he could bleed, that he could run. Montgisard was proof that the invincible was never truly invincible. Nearly 900 years later, why is Montgisard still worth telling? Because it's the ultimate proof that the history we inherit is almost always told only halfway. We remember Saladin, the winner. We forget the day he fled on a camel. We remember the Crusaders as the side that lost. We forget that among them were some of the most disciplined and feared warriors the world has ever seen. Men who, outnumbered more than 50 to 1, chose to attack instead of flee, and won. Montgisard is a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to ride toward an army 50 times your size because something exists that matters more than your own life. It's a reminder that a ruined body can carry the strongest will in a kingdom. And it's a reminder that numbers impress, but it's the men who refuse to retreat who write history. The Templars became legend for many reasons. The mystery, the treasure, the tragic fall. But the original reason, the real one, is this. On fields like Montgisard, 80 men in white cloaks made the impossible look routine. And the greatest enemy they ever faced spent the rest of his life knowing it. So the next time someone tells you Saladin was invincible or that the Crusaders were just amateurs doomed to lose, tell them about November 25th, 1127. The day a 16-year-old king, dying of leprosy, and 80 monks in white cloaks shattered 26,000 men and sent the greatest conqueror of the East fleeing the field on a camel.